So in this movie, I'm going to dig a little bit deeper into some of the settings that we have available with our walls. I'm going to start off by talking about how you can actually display more detail within the walls themselves. So what I have on screen here is just a simple wall, and I'm in a floor plan called Detail Levels. Now, if you look at the bottom of this view window, bottom left-hand corner, there's the view control bar. Now, there's a scale pop-up first, and then right next to that, there's a little open white square. And if I click that, that's actually a little pop-up menu. And there's 3 items there, fine, medium, and coarse. If you set the display level of the view to either medium or fine, then it will display any internal layers within the wall structure. In coarse, it only shows the outline of the wall. So for example, if I choose medium, notice that this wall that I have displayed on screen is actually a pretty complex wall. Within its internal structure, it's got several components which REVIT calls layers. So starting here on the left side, there's a brick layer, then an air gap, some insulation, a concrete masonry unit, some furring, and finally a piece of drywall. Now, all of those layers display when we change the level of detail, and all of those layers are settings that are shared by all instances of this wall type. So we'll look at that in a little bit more detail shortly. When we select the wall, if we look over at the properties palette, there are some properties that pertain to just this wall that I have selected. Now, we saw some of those in the previous movie. We talked about the base constraint and the top constraint and the unconnected height, for example. We didn't talk about the location line yet, so that's what I want to talk about right now. That's an instance level setting, and it affects each wall you have selected. So what do I mean by that? Well, let's go over to this view here called location lines. And what I've done in this view is I've actually got the same wall, but as you can see, I've layered some text and some drafting elements on top of it to kind of label the parts and pieces. So what I've done first is I've highlighted in orange here what we call the core of the wall. So with all those internal layers displayed, we can see that each one has a different material. Well, at least one of those layers has to be the core of the wall. Every wall has a core. Now, you don't actually have to have anything more than the core, but you can, of course, as you can see. Now, in this case, the concrete masonry units is the core, and the easiest way to think about that is the core is just the part of the wall that actually holds the wall up. So in this case, the concrete masonry units are the structural component of this wall. On the right-hand side, we have interior finishes, the furring and the drywall, and on the left-hand side, we have the exterior finishes, the brick veneer. Now, you can measure 6 different points on the wall and use those as the location line. You can see them labeled here. So we can use the outermost face on the interior edge, or the outermost face on the exterior edge, or the center line of the wall itself, halfway between those. And then we have the same 3 points relative to the core. We can have the interior face of the core, the exterior face of the core, or the center line of the core. So if I select this wall, you can see all of those listed right here. And so with a wall like this, you can kind of get a sense of how those work. Well, let's see those in action. So I'm going to come over here to this view called Wall Types. And what you can see is I have this small box drawn on screen. Now I'm going to use my zoom in region and just kind of zoom in on that box. This is the wall that we were just talking about, but let's focus on these 4 walls instead. And I want you to pay attention to these dimensions here as I make some of these changes. So this wall is currently set, all of them are currently set to wall centerline. So I'm going to leave the top wall set to wall centerline. You can see it right there. But then I'm going to change the other 3 to different settings. So this one I'm going to choose core centerline. This one I'm going to choose finish face exterior. And this one I'm going to choose core face interior. Now it doesn't really matter which ones you choose as long as you choose different ones for each one. Now the only real effect of that change that you can see at the moment is that the little grip points that determine the endpoints of the walls have shifted to those new locations. So you can see here we're at the core face interior, here we're at the finish face, here we're down the center line of the core. Notice that the dimensions are unchanged. So it actually shifted within the wall itself, but it didn't move the wall. There's really 2 places where you care what the location line is. If I zoom in a little bit closer, what you're going to notice is these walls are backwards. They're reversed. The brick is on the inside of the building and the drywall is on the outside of the building, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So I'm going to come over here and on the navigation bar here, I'm going to choose previous zoom to back out again, select one of these walls, and notice that there's a small flip grip right here. If I click that, this wall, see where its grips are? This is the one that we set to finish face exterior. Watch what happens when I click this flip. Notice that the location line stays put and the entire wall flipped around that location line. So it actually had a pretty dramatic impact on the overall shape of the building in this case because it moved the wall. Notice the dimension has changed. Now this wall, because it's using centerline, would be unchanged if I flipped it. So notice that this dimension did not change. So you can see the impact of having different location lines. Now the other way you can flip the wall instead of clicking the flip grip is to actually tap the space bar, and that will do the same thing. So if I flip all of these to get to the brick to the outside, you can see the effect that that has. Now the other place where you'll see the impact of the location line is if you change the thickness of the wall. That's also an instance property because we can come over here to this drop-down, the type selector drop-down, and we can just choose a different kind of wall. So let's say I chose this generic 140 millimeter masonry wall. Well, that wall gets significantly thinner, but notice that it maintained its location line. So all of the thickness was removed essentially from the outside of the building. If I undo that and show it to you again, right, here's where the grips are, and then I change the thickness, you can see that all the thickness came from the bottom, basically. So those are some of the instance properties and some of the impact that they have, and specifically the location line and how important that can be if you're either changing the thickness of the wall or if you're changing the orientation. But what about type properties? Well, we already kind of hinted that all this composition within these walls is determined at the type level. So let's see that in a little bit more detail. I'm going to zoom in here just a touch, just to get in a little bit closer. And I'm going to select one of these walls. It doesn't matter which one. And I'm going to choose this button here on the Properties palette to edit type. Now, when you choose edit type, it allows you to see the settings that apply to all instances of this wall. So we're now actually modifying the definition of exterior brick on CMU, and any change you make is going to affect all of them, whether they're selected or not. Right here we have structure, and then we have this edit button. I'm going to click that, and you'll see this table appear that lists out all of those layers that we've been talking about throughout the movie. Let's widen this dialog so that we can read it a little bit better. You can stretch this out so that these are more legible. Here's the core boundary, and notice that both of those are 0. So they have no thickness. They just define where the boundary ends and where the finishes begin. Now, it's actually possible for you to remove all of these layers if you wanted to. However, notice that the structure layer cannot be deleted. Okay, so you have to have at least one layer within the core. That's required. But everything else could be deleted if you wanted to. I could insert new layers in the core. So your core can actually contain more than one layer. It just can't have fewer than one. Let's just do something that's going to be fairly obvious here. I'm going to come up here and remove the brick and the air gap. Now, that's kind of a silly change to make because you wouldn't typically just have a wall with exposed insulation. But what I want you to see is the impact of that change on not only the wall that's selected, but on the other 3 instances as well. So you'll notice that that brick and that air gap gets removed everywhere. And that's really the point of what we mean by a type level modification. Now, I should point out that we did everything here with walls, but the same concept applies to everything in Revit. So nearly every element in Revit has both instance and type properties. And so if you understand the concept of what it means to edit at those 2 levels, that's going to apply across the entire Revit software package.